example, I do a lot of work with runners, and of course trying to identify movement behavior that underlies injury. And we'll be talking a lot about this in today's lecture. And I don't think it takes a PhD to figure out what he's doing wrong. Okay? But here's the key. We have to identify what these movement behaviors are that increase loading, in this case on the patellofemoral joint. But most importantly, we have to come up with a clinical plan to correct this. So when I see this kid back in 3 months, I expect these angles to change. I want to see less pelvic drop. I want to see less dynamic knee dominance. That is where the rubber meets the road. Okay? So we can talk all we want about mechanical applications, but what it really boils down to is we have to fix and change this. All right? And I'll give you my philosophy on that as part of my talk today. I also do a lot of return to sport evaluations for people who have undergone ACL injury. When we look at this soccer athlete plant and do a deceleration move, you can clearly see that we have a biomechanical issue here. And he plants, he's going full speed, so this is in slow motion. But you clearly see that when he decelerates on a single limb, he has no limb or pelvic control. And because of that, his limb collapses inward, exposing his ACL graft. He's had ACL reconstruction. And by the way, he's been cleared to return to sport by his orthopedic surgeon and by his physical therapist. But you know what? Nobody has looked at his biomechanical function. No one has evaluated whether he is ready to return following his rehab process. And this, to me, is the power of the biomechanical approach. We can see things that we miss in everyday practice and training. Trunk position influences how the load is distributed. And we're still talking about shock absorption. So what do you notice between A and B? Trunk is forward, obviously. How does that forward trunk affect the moment distribution at the hip and knee? If the vector is closer to the joint center, there's less of a torque. So in A, her knee torque is small, her hip torque is big. So getting the center mass forward encourages a hip strategy. And we use this a lot in our training and rehab to get people to use the hips better. It's getting the trunk forward. When you land with more of an erect trunk, as in B, the tendency is to have a higher torque at the knee and less at the hip, i.e. a knee dominant strategy. So you can actually modulate the demands of the lower extremity by influencing the trunk position. And this has been shown by our group and others in terms of landing and things. Now, what does this mean in the context of runners? Now, I said earlier, a major thing for runners, you need shock absorption. Without good active shock absorption, you're going to be exposed to a slew of injuries. I think that most running patterns that are being advocated today, especially more the barefoot, minimalistic running patterns, you don't use your hip as much. You take short, choppy steps. You don't use the hip as much. The way you get more hip involved, hip extensor involvement, is, to be honest with you, got to get the limb forward. And in fact, I actually train runners the exact opposite everyone else does, take longer steps and less cadence. Why? Because I want them to use more hip in the running pattern. And not just in the sagittal plane for shock absorption, but I'm talking frontal and transverse plane as well. The runner needs hip control. And the only way to get hip control is you better be activating the hip. If you're not activating the hip, you're not using any. And I think most tendency now, you run like this, more erect, feet are underneath you, you're bouncing on your calf and your quads. But my feeling is that the picture on the right is far better than what I see on the left. Now it's important to note, look at her trunk position. The trunk is forward. And that encourages more of a hip moment and a reduction in the knee moment. All right? Now, if you're going to extend the limb and hit with the heel, you better have good shock absorption. You better have that trunk forward, or else you're going to be potentially exposed to injury. So my view on running is quite different from everyone else's, especially in this particular city in particular. So I'm not a big fan of the current trends of running. I'd much rather see it on the right than the left. More hip flexion, more knee flexion, more shock absorption, forward trunk. This actually takes some of the demand off the knee. Here's an example of quad dominance in real life here. Here's a volleyball athlete. Yeah, this is about as quad dominant as you can get. All right, see that? There's no hip flexion. The knees are shooting forward. And you know, if someone's squatting like this in your weight room, you probably put a gun to their head. You know that this is bad for the knee. Quad dominance. How can you tell clinically? Well, we've all seen this 100 times throughout, millions of times throughout our career. When you see this pattern, the knees shoot forward. There's excessive dorsiflexion. The heels rotate off the ground, and there's no hip flexion. These are the hallmark signs of quad dominance. And we train people in the weight room, obviously, out of this. We train them to use their thing. And I'm a former power lifter myself, and I know through experience that, hey, if you're not using your hip as a power lifter, you can't lift very much weight. So hip strategy, and you get all the power using hip. But when you lack hip strength, you go to the secondary source. And that secondary source is quad. And most athletes have strong quads, so they end up using the quad in spite of it. Now, when you look at runners, this is a very common thing that you see in runners, is that you see this tendency to be quad dominant. You see here, at peak knee flexion, the knee is translated forward of the knee. The heel's rotating off the ground. There's excessive dorsiflexion. And importantly, there's no hip flexion. This person is overloading the knee, overloading the quadricep. And I think this is a major contributor to knee pain in runners. So how am I going to treat this? Well, I'm going to get them to use more hip. First, I have to assess their hip strength, make sure they have the strength in multiple performance to handle that. Then you got to work on their running mechanics. But you know that this pattern here is more likely to load the patellofemoral joint in particular. Now, when you look at this panel here, at the top you have, by the way, these two go together, and then these two go together. That number is the peak ground reaction force, right? Which strategy would you want? I'm taking the one on the right. And guess what? I converted her from a midfoot strike to a heel strike. Oh my God, that's breaking the rules. But you know what?